speaker is Ágnes Básthy. She's a PhD student of the Budapest University. Please come. And her talk is called Crisis of What? Crisis of What? Taking a suspicious walk around the fashionable notions. Please.
Can I have light?
She's reading, yeah.
I'm a boomer, sorry. Can I have this light? Yeah, okay. Hi everyone. Now we are a few steps backward and talking about a bit society, not about this thing about art, but more about a wider aspect of the whole crisis. At least I attempt to. Crisis was originally a medical concept which was ignited in the Hippocratic corpus of text. The moment when the doctor decided whether the patient would be able to survive the disease. Theologians reprised the term to indicate the final judgment that occurs during the last day. If we look at the state of exception which we are now experiencing, we could say that medical religion combines the perpetual crisis of capitalism with the Christian idea of the end times, of an escalon where the extreme decision is constantly ongoing and where the end is simultaneously rushed and deferred in an incessant effort to govern it, without its ever being resolved once and for all. It is the religion of a world that feels itself to be at its end and yet it cannot, like the Hippocratic doctor, decide whether it will survive or die. These sentences are written by Giorgio Agamben and can be found in his provocative essay, Medicine as Religion, born during the COVID pandemic. As to formulate crisis used to be a useful word, but for now it has become incorporated in the vocabulary of governance. I may add that in the pseudo-scientific language of managerialism, it is used for decades to cover up responsibility and as a helping hand in managing the unmanageable. We know from Boltanski and Schiaparello that in the self-adapting system called capitalism, such words as crisis are only phrases or phases of temporary dysfunction, mostly followed by something more hideous and elevated structure. Because of these, I have serious concerns about the use of crisis as a descriptive notion of the situation in which we are living now. The intensification of destruction and anxiety is the consequence of the logical, rationalized extraction of late modern capitalism. We are living in the late phase of the historical and material process based on the self-destroying logic. I don't believe that words are their own can change the world. However, I do believe that notions are fundamentally shaping our perspective on the world around us and our consciousness. You can call it ideology, or just accept that certain notions have agendas, and agendas have certain notions, and these can change over time. I have to assert that in our times, crisis justifies new, more extreme ways of governing. Justification and legitimation are key notions in this case. Zsuzsanna Zubov, the author of The Age of Servants, Capitalism, penned her concern based on the Agamben's thoughts. The declaration of the state of exemption functions in politics as cover for the suspension of the rule of law and the introduction of a new executive powers justified by crisis. So, the last and most dangerous turn in the career of crisis was a concept that came to be a speech act, a favorite magic spell of the contemporary political black magic. Declaring crisis nowadays is an ultimate legitimation, not just for austerity measurements in the economy, but the most widespread and harmful antisocial measurements. Crisis can be caused by migration, war, pandemic, terrorism, or ecological catastrophe, but the pure declaration itself is an active component in executing the most oppressive, authoritarian, tyrannic political actions. We can say otherwise, the declaration of the crisis is summoning the so-called self-appointed, often nefarious saviors in the sphere of politics. Since Michel Foucault subverted the way we think about power, it is more or less evident for the intelligentsia that power is exercised through a diffuse and widespread apparatus in which surveillance has an outstanding role. This is why Zhukov emphasized that we are not living in digital capitalism but surveillance capitalism, which means that the component of power in contemporary communication technology is based on the few centuries-old practices of surveillance. Concerning the latest evolution in the technology of surveillance, Zhukov highlighted the notion of surveillance exceptionalism, which she connected to the date of 2001, which was the year of the notorious terrorist attack against the World Trade Center in New York City, USA. This was a game-changing and life-changing event, since it was the big push for the cooperation of the CIA and Google, so the establishment of the engaged alliance between surveillance capitalists and secret services. Unless I was only a child back then, I do remember, and I guess many of you remember as well, the so-called war on terror of the Bush era. The ambience of propaganda, war, racism and paranoia, the intensifying securitization, the scandalous and later unveiled political lies and secrets, and the rigorous measurements legitimated by the politics of the state of exception had a deep, widespread and long-lasting effect on the international politics and even on the more private and local social measures almost everywhere on the planet. The state of exception generated by the declaration of crisis during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2010 was very similar in many aspects, mostly because it was a global event with global consequences. The application of digital technologies in and for the surveillance of the population, ranging from the track and trace apps and the authoritarian and obtrusive measurements, support the perspective to see this event at the next level of surveillance exceptionalism, which was made possible not just by the networks of the internet, but the mobile digital technology attached to our body, which became an essential form of living during the last 2 decades. But what kind of political intentions, ideologies and industrial interests can be discovered behind these developments? Sometimes it is worth trusting your intuition, whether you are a social scientist or an artist, and attempting to make visible the invisible. Anything we or leaders mean under the notion of crisis, it's more or less visible that social and technological phenomena are converging toward a new kind of order in social control. A dangerously tightening entanglement of science and technology with capital, emerging as a political power supported by a propaganda apparatus which penetrates and interlaces with media. This is why the COVID situation seems so apocalyptic, and this proved the importance of analyzing the crisis of science, which remained after the scandalously managed pandemic. Later, and the recent crisis of science was and is the culmination point of processes which have been ongoing for decades. The politics of life sciences, the politics of life itself, has been shaped by those who control the human, technical and financial resources, as Nicholas Rose pointed out this fact. Biopower merged with high-end technologies which transformed or expressively abolished most of the moral and ethical constraints related to living bodies. To quote Rose again, the classical distinction made in moral philosophy between that which is not human, ownable, tradable, commodifiable, and which is human, not legitimate material for such commodification, no longer seems so stable. Computing these still and even more relevant words, the subversion and transformation of moral economies of societies are not without resistance and backlash. When the big capital starts to define a relationship to life and subordinates us to its own logic, there will be consequences, which means problems and crises, and finally new forms of control. But as a Hungarian poet once wrote, én nem így képzeltem el a rendet. This is not how I imaged the orderliness. But let's see how Zhukov described the situation. It may be possible to imagine something like Internet of Things without surveillance capitalism, but it is important to imagine, but it's impossible to imagine surveillance capitalism without something like the Internet of Things. Every command arising from the prediction imperative requires the pervasive real-world material, knowing and doing presence. The new apparatus is a material expression of the prediction imperative, and it represents a kind of power animated by economic compulsion towards certainty. Two vectors converge in this fact. The early ideas of ubiquitous computing and the economic imperatives of surveillance capitalism. This convergence signals the metamorphosis of the digital infrastructure from a thing that we have to a thing that has us. Unless this strategy is new, the constellation of capital, technology and control has been with us since modernity. This is why we shouldn't leave any of these components out of our analysis. Jubal is very explicit at this point when she writes, surveillance capitalism employs many technologies, but it cannot be equated with any technology. Its operations may employ platforms, but its operations are not the same as platforms. It employs machine intelligence, but it cannot be reduced to the machines. It produces and relies on algorithms, but it is not the same as algorithms. Surveillance capitalism's unique economic imperatives are the puppet masters that hide behind the curtain, orienting the machines and summoning them to action. These imperatives, to indulge another metaphor, are like the body's soft tissue that cannot be seen in the X-ray, but do the real work of binding muscle and bone. We are not alone in falling prey to the technology illusion. It is an enduring theme of social talk and as old as the Trojan horse. Despite this, each generation stumbles into the quicksand of forgetting that technology is an expression of other interests. In modern times, this means the interest of capital, and in our time, it's surveillance capital that comments the digital milieu and reflects our trajectory toward the future. So what is our personal relationship to this as human beings? We can ask the question otherwise. Who do the often repeated slogans, how do the often repeated slogans of transhumanism and posthumanism, like shifting boundaries of humanity, relate to capital, especially to digital and biotechnology, big tech, big pharma? Nicholas Rose emphasized the power of capital in subjectivization process since the beginning of the millennium. For example, when he wrote, "The philosophical status, indeed the very ontology of human beings, is being reshaped through the decisions of interpreters as to where to invest the capital and which lines of biomedical research and development to pursue." Therefore, some of the biggest, hardest and most uncomfortable questions of our time is how this technological apparatus, driven by capitalist interest, shapes our subjectivity, how it affects our subjectification, our relation to ourselves, our desires and our choices, which lead us back to the question of power and subjectification conceptualized by the aforementioned Foucault. What we are seeing today is that the boundaries between the self and the market are blurring gradually with the means and media of invasive and ubiquitous persuading apparatus which behavior manipulation and modification and add to chemical interventions targeting directly ourselves. I can see reflective, profound, radical critique, and neither in the hardest question asked in the mainstream of contemporary art. This latter takes the role of the mirror, which only reflects and do not analyze nor criticize. I also see that despite the intensifying social control, pressure and obvious manipulation, most of the philosophers are affirmative, if not enthusiastic, and quailing in fault of the power of the technological apparatus, which heart beats the rhythm of the capital, if it's not one with it. I still need to face, understand and contextualize the manipulative nature of the power relations in which this technological culture is embedded, but the stakes have never been so high. Meanwhile, the so-called progress, which made our life easier in some ways, moderately transformed our possibilities and has many biopolitical consequences as well. For example, the key components of obedience are the lack of knowledge and the real choice, which sharply limits autonomy. Nowadays, it seems like the intelligentsia accepted that there is no chance for diverting the ongoing technological trajectory. According to Zhubov, the colonization of all intellectual critical apparatus is intentional, and she denominated it as inevitabilism. According to her, the concept of inevitability is a Trojan horse for powerful economic imperatives. It is an ideology of marketing and a marketing strategy in the aggressive colonization and transformation of the material world. For these purposes, it applies distorting rhetoric based on the false premise that the trajectory of technological progress is inevitable. Here is how Zhubov disassembles it. The image of technology as an autonomous force with unavoidable actions and consequences had been employed across the centuries to erase the fingertips of power and absolve it of responsibility. The monster did it, not Victor Frankenstein. However, the ankle bracelet does not monitor the prisoner. The criminal justice system does that. Every doctrine of inability carries a weaponized virus of moral nihilism programmed to target human agency and delete resistance and creativity from the text of human possibility. Inevitability rhetoric is a cunning frog designed to render us helpless and passive in the face of implacable forces that must always be indifferent to the merely human. This is a world of robotized interface where technologies work their will, resolutely protecting power from challenge. Inevitalism is a self-fulfilling prophecy of modernist thought, and today the utopianism of Silicon Valley, but never forget, somebody's utopia is somebody else's dystopia. I also find it dangerous that social, political, and art theory and a considerable part of the art world take, use, and set in motion some notions of late modernist managerialism uncritically and without reflection. Do we want to sustain the unsustainable and manage the unmanageable? Do we want to be contributors to the neoliberal agenda of managing the consequences? The notion of crisis implied a temporary rupture or repairable malfunction of a system that more or less works. It is something that describes our world at this very moment. Can we truly believe in this? And I don't think that completing the notion with prefixes like perma or poly can help us neither in thinking nor in acting. Engaging in building a more radical vocabulary which enables more radical actions, we should consider what is power, control, freedom, and autonomy, and realize that the cardinal question is still who or what exerts them. You can tell this is just a question of priorities, but I would call it vigilance and awareness. Understanding the modernist roots of all thinking about technology and empowerment is key to finding the new ways of thinking and getting rid of the role offered to us as social engineers in a system which obviously not working according to our moral and social values we believe in. In my opinion, always lead back to the project of modernity, the reconsideration, the understanding and the critique of it. Since modernity, the developed technologies were originally created as control tools based on the results of scientific knowledge. And this also leaves its mark on the unintended consequences of the operation, not least forming their user through their inherent logic based on effectivity. But the component of power can be found in the relationship of the subject or actor, and the tool means technology, a means of technology. As Don Koshing pointed out, the most basic expectation toward technology is that the device itself is fully controlled by its users. That is, it should not have its own will, but should always follow the intentions of the actor. Another expectation is that it helps the subject to increase the efficiency of the rule exercised over the world. These expectations are subverted by the artificial intelligence, because it seems like a border state of human-technology hybrids in which the latter become dominant. So this change in the power relation is the real and cardinal turning point, not the hybridization, which is the favorite buzzword magic spell of contemporary philosophers. Hybridization is an ongoing, but actually unreflective process since the dawn of humanity, if we believe Latour. So what we can win or lose in this turning process. The whole set of problems beautifully highlighted by sociologist Domoko Sik in his text, Only an AI Can Save Us. In this essay, he presents that what is really frightening in the AI for all human societies is in reality the heart of the modernist thought. The naked instrumental rationality as its inhumanity made visible by this entity, if we can call it like this. He asserts that facing this hard and harsh truth is giving us a chance to save ourselves and change the world we built around us. Sik follows the intellectual tradition of the critic of modernity when he highlights the totalitarian tendencies that are embedded in the premises of modernity. It is important to emphasize that behind the sphere are especially the silent taboos of the modernity. The modern man is the one who measures the value of the things by effectiveness of control, who considers everything that is not efficient enough to the worthless, disposable and destroyable. The modern man is the one who asserts that amorality of technical rationality organized according to the exclusive aspects of efficiency. Centuries of colonialism, genocides based on race theory and nazism all exemplified where the absolutization of superiority identified as efficiency can lead, although not in the relationship between man and tool, but between man and man. And this, moreover, does not require artificial intelligence. Modern man applied this principle himself in the past when he set out to destroy fellow human beings he deemed unnecessary. And it also enforces it in the present, and it reproduces the extreme forms of social suffering through the indirect mechanism of exploitation along the chains of global inequality. Moreover, endangering not only certain groups, but humanity as a whole. Then he goes on. The artificial intelligence that emerged as a result of instrumental rationalization poses a threat to human identity only if we accept that the moral order of modernization narrowed to efficiency. If we can only give enough meaning to life to dominate the world and others. In such an approach, we will necessarily lose against technological systems and AI because sooner or later it will dominate the world and us in it more efficiently than we do. However, nothing determines us to get stuck in the amorality or of efficiency. If we find a value and meaning that can be the basis of a life worth of man, then the picture is already rearranged. So we can conclude that AI, as a new product in the process of functional interdimensional rationality, wakes up the bad conscience of modernity and forces us to reevaluate all social values to decide what is worth preserving in human existence. In other words, what it is about being human that makes it worth staying human. What is this all to do with dignity or dignified existence? Since we can turn back history, we shouldn't, the potential strategy is overcoming or way of escape forward, which means that we need to rediscover the human values that we have forgotten in the process of efficiency maximization, and we have to save and reposition them through further hybridization process. What we can also conclude is that we need awareness in the first place. Every threat to human autonomy begins with a certain awareness. And this is why consciousness is attacked by surveillance capitalism. This phenomenon is carefully analyzed by Zhubov in her book. Individual awareness is the enemy of telestimulation because it is the necessary condition for the mobilization of cognitive and existential resources. There is no autonomous judgment without awareness. Agreement and disagreement, participation and withdrawal, resistance and collaboration, none of these self-regulating choices can exist without awareness. Meanwhile, what we call self-control is a set of practices which are interiorized by human socialization, hence, in this sense, not independent from the power relations and other cultural specificities which define a certain society. But connection of autonomy with awareness and the ability of self-control is crucial. Philosophers recognize self-regulation, self-determination, autonomy as freedom of will. The word autonomy derives from the Greek and literally means regulation by the self. It stands in contrast with heteronomy, which means regulation by others. The competitive necessity of economies of action means that surveillance capitalists must use all means available to supplant autonomous action with heteronomous action.
Excuse me, that said duty to